What is up, everyone? It's Friday. I am Stuart P. Turner, and this is the Flow State Podcast. Welcome back if you've joined me before, and welcome for the first time if this is your first time listening. It's a pleasure to have you join me for today's show. So, what I thought I would do today is, something a little bit different. I suppose explain a more recent update on why the brand Flow State itself exists, its connections to the Flow State itself, the concept, which I will explain if you have not heard of it before, and answer a question that people have been asking me for many years. What do you actually do with your degree, Stu? And I'm very pleased to say that it's once again become quite top of mind for everybody. So, not really directly work related, but in some ways very directly work related. So let's get into it. So let me share something with you that I saw recently, which is why I wanted to talk about this stuff today. So I'm going to attempt to talk and do stuff at the same time, which is not always my core skill set, but here we go. So I saw this article recently on The Independent, which was very interesting. So the article's not interesting. It's a short summary of a discussion that's very interesting. So have a watch of this discussion. I'll drop the links below the episode as usual. But the gist of the discussion is that one of the top AI scientists from Google has told us all what he thinks the next generation's most needed skill is. So he doesn't just say that. Obviously, it doesn't take an hour just to say one thing. But the conversation is very interesting, held as it was in a Roman theatre in Athens, which once was the heart of democratized knowledge back in the day, in what some might describe as the glory days of democracy and government in ancient Rome and ancient Greece. The classical era. I mean, there was a lot of fighting there. Let's not beat around the bush. But they also did a lot of declaiming and discussing and public sharing of great knowledge. But look, the short version is, I'll skip to the end of the discussion for you. This AI guy from Google, right, basically says, look, we need to once again learn how to learn. And the reason that he says that is, as I'm sure you are aware, we are living in relatively unprecedented times in terms of the volume of information that is available at your fingertips, right? So, going back to what I was saying about our old mates, our toga-wearing friends back in the ancient times, explaining and debating publicly in amphitheatres across ancient Greece and the Roman Empire, right? You might have a few thousand people who might turn up every day there, a decent proportion of people, maybe be even more, decent proportion of people for the time, right? And that would be where the sort of discussion was happening, or it was written in books or letters and sent to people. So the scale of the conversation and the sort of zeitgeist of where knowledge was being pushed forward was small by comparison to today. Skip ahead to now, and we have tools to share knowledge faster and in much more, sort of extreme volumes, I guess you would say, than ever before. However, I would suggest that the quality of that information and the provenance of the knowledge contained therein has descended pretty dramatically as well, almost in direct proportion to our ability to share. So the challenge we now have is, how do you understand, or how do you even begin to know what is credible, what is actually accurate? I barely dare even use the word what is true, because anyone can say anything about anything almost anywhere now. So the challenge we all have, which is where, if you're familiar with the sort of slow descent of Facebook from a fun place to stalk up your old girlfriends or boyfriends or whatever to a, polarized hellhole of fake knowledge, is that people just read stuff and just assume that it's true, which is incredibly dangerous, which I'm going to come on to. And one of the reasons that I'm still a big fan of parts of, what's now the mainstream media, which I know we don't like, do we, today? But if you follow proper journalists, a part of their job is to source things, check their sources, verify sources, establish that the information that they are sharing is credible before they publish it. And that, back in the olden days before the internet, was why people respect journalists and journalism. Now, I'm not saying that everyone in that industry deserves that level of respect, because some people who call themselves journalists are a far cry from that, sort of ideal state. But look, that's the idea that, and look, I do my best to do the same thing. I try and check what I am telling you in these shows and just make sure that I'm not spouting off garbage like so many people who can do what I'm doing right now, because I think it's very important that that what we share is not just what you believe to be true, but is objectively sort of verified somewhere, because otherwise we're just having an interesting discussion about our opinions, which is fine, but not when they're characterized as facts. And if you've ever seen Inside Out, there's a very amusing little aside about the mixing of facts and opinions in there. I won't spoil anything about the film if you haven't watched it, but it gave me a little dry chuckle when I saw that. Very amusing. Anyway, slightly beside the point. So look, this conversation is super interesting. I highly recommend that you jump on and watch it, because it's really interesting, whether you agree or not with what everyone says. So I know what you're thinking. You're like, Stu, this is all quite fascinating, but what does this have to do with Flow State, your shameless pursuit of money through the company that you've built, and why we should care about Flow State and why we should care about philosophy? So let me tell you why you should care. So, as I said, I am not a marketer by trade. I'm not a salesperson by trade. I used to think that both of those industries were somewhat dirty and wouldn't ever dream of entering them in my younger and more pretentious days when I was at uni. Because what I studied at uni was philosophy. And the reason that I did that was because I found the idea of the study of how you study and the pursuit of knowledge in its purest academic form quite fascinating, and I still do. That's what attracted me to the digital industry. And the digital industry is what's led me to now being immersed in two worlds that I previously would have held my nose at and wandered past. So, little did I know at the time that this is where this would take me, but it has. And following on from that interview, the reason that philosophy is important, and I'm going to explain why most people misunderstand what philosophy is because philosophy in and of itself is obviously the pursuit of knowledge. So, like, translated most directly, it translates as the love of wisdom. And most people misuse the term to describe a philosophy, like a way of thinking, or something has a philosophy, which doesn't really make any sense, and also think that it's just like a load of waffling about nonsense, like people being like, why does this do that, why is this, what is this, which on the one hand it kind of is, right? It's most I guess obtuse academic level, that sort of is what it is. However, the exercise of thinking through things purely, by thinking them is quite valuable, because going through that process is what teaches you how to learn, how to think critically, how to assess whether something is sensible or just a crazy, stupid idea, how to even go about taking a, mad concept that you've just come up with and then starting to attach it to the real world, I'll say that in very loose terms, and also, verify or not that theory. And that's obviously the foundation of the scientific method, right? Where you need to take an idea or a concept or a hypothesis, and then you need to test that hypothesis. And basically you are looking for failure, like the science is like, how do we make this not work in order, by a process of elimination, to find something that does work and therefore prove our theory or our hypothesis. But look, it's important to note, going back to the philosophical roots, that everything's changing all the time, and there's a bit of an assumption that once we've proved something, it's ineffably true forever, and that is false. But that idea scares a lot of people, right? So science is constantly trying to prove things false. Everything changes all the time, right? And just because something's repeatable and provable, or provable and repeatable now, doesn't mean it will be forever, because we might come up with a different or better theory, or we might discover something new. So I'm getting to a point about how all this relates to marketing and work, but the important thing here is, we are going through a period of pretty crazy change at the moment. Everyone's still obsessing over AI. Digital technology is advancing faster than ever. This is all cool stuff. Like, I love the idea of where we can go with the internet, with digital technology, with the tools that we have to hand. That's all very exciting. But as with any period of great change, there is a dangerous and significant undertow of just, general, everybody doing everything, people not really thinking before they do stuff, driven typically by, merchants such as myself, if you want to put it into old school terms, and also the hardcore capitalist, some might call them bastards. I wouldn't necessarily say that, who drive a large part of the digital industry, right? Like they just rush to do stuff because it will make them money. And sometimes rushing to do things is not necessarily the best way. Like you can have haste without the speed. So, in answer to the question now of what loads of my people in my teams and my colleagues have been like, Stu, what do you do with your degree? And I used to somewhat flippantly, have an array of responses like, I use it to be your boss. I use it to, just be better than you at insert thing. Critical thinking and I suppose the application of what I'd learned when I was doing my degree is how I've arrived here and how I've gone from basically messing around on the internet to having a now, I would say relatively successful career in digital, despite having no real formal training in any kind of data science, any kind of real, like I can code a bit, but I'm not like a developer by any means. But the degree that I did in my prior education allows me to understand those things quite quickly at relatively sort of detailed-ish level without needing to do them, and then work with a load of other people who can do them and, bring people together to do the stuff that I've done. So, I guess in answer to that question, what I do with my degree is like, well, everything that I'm doing now. But I've now been, very much validated by neuroscientists, chess masters, this is just the one guy, Google people, and everyone else now who's suddenly like, oh my God, I've been chatting to an AI and it's just made up a ton of stuff. And you're like, yeah, of course it has. Because you don't understand how they work and you're just assuming that everything that they tell you is true. Whereas the default philosophical position, or the default scientific position, if you want to take a different tack, is to immediately assume that everything's false and then try and prove that it's true. So that position is powerful, and that is one of the most powerful sort of mindsets that you could be in when you're addressing, or the many challenges that we now face. So how does that relate to Flow State, the brand, and what I kind of wanted to get into today? Well, the importance, I guess, of Flow State, the concept. I just want to explain what that is first before I get into like why I built a brand around it, and what we're doing with Flow State, the business. Is Flow State itself is basically being in the zone. That's what it's known as colloquially. It means being in deep concentration to the point where, all distractions are, out of your mind. You don't really sort of, an hour, 2 hours can pass because you're so deeply focused on what you're doing and in a kind of state of positive enjoyment of doing the task that everything else just, is pushed out of your brain. And that's a provable concept, which was first, I don't want to say discovered. It was first posited or coined by Mihail, I'm going to probably totally butcher his surname, Csikszentmihalyi. I'm sorry about that. He's a Hungarian who came up with this concept and the idea of flow, the secret to happiness. Now, there is a TED talk on it from 2004. Again, I'll share the link for this, where he explains what it is and how it works. But it's a provable state of mind that everybody can get into, where you get into that deep, positive flow of concentration to the exclusion of everything else. Now, if you want a more contemporary encapsulation or version of that, you can watch the Pixar movie Soul, which has a great sort of series of different ways that they conceptualize what that's like. But everybody, to an extent, has experienced being in the zone. It just means you like, sort of really enjoying something. You're like, oh my God, I didn't even realize that it's now lunchtime and I'm super hungry. And the reason that I like this concept is because obviously it's directly tied to like stuff that I was doing in my degree, that sort of hardcore pursuit of something that you really enjoy. I'm a musician as well. I think when you get in the zone of just being creative and doing stuff, it's awesome. That's when you really feel like things are just happening, and it's like a really cool kind of mindset to be in. And that's when you do like your best work, or you can kind of bring the best out of yourself, I think, where you're just really in tune with like doing something. The sort of, the knowledge of doing it and the theory of what you're doing is seamlessly merged with the act of doing as well, which is almost similar to the kind of, Buddhist concepts of, submerging or destroying the ego and just being directly sort of attuned to what you're doing, which is a conversation for another time. But look, the modern world is essentially constantly trying to chip away at your ability to get into that zone. And you'll have seen this with the, the number of, or the increasing number of people getting diagnosed with like ADHD or related conditions, for example. People struggling to concentrate. There was that whole concept across social media of people's attention spans shortening. But I think the idea of someone's attention span getting shorter is actually a symptom of the fact that you can't concentrate properly because of all this constant like noise and stimulus and devices that are constantly pinging at you. And like, to a degree, these behaviors that the digital industry have trained us on, and this is where, the people at the top of companies like Facebook have a lot to answer for, because they actively developed their products to train people to respond and spend more time on the network, right? And like all the big social networks have done that, and this was quite widely publicized probably about 10 or 15 years ago, and then just disappeared, I assume because they don't want anyone really knowing about it, right? But a lot of developers came out from Facebook in particular, and were saying that they were actively developing for those, what I would suggest are pretty horrible negative behaviors. Like, how do we notify people to get them to log back in? How do we keep them scrolling through stuff? Like, all those changes to the feed that we all hate were all based around that behavioral control. And, without getting all tinfoil hat about it, like, that's how they make all their money. They just want to keep your attention on their platform. And like, I don't even know if we're still in the attention economy anymore, but that was a concept that was getting thrown around a few years ago. But that was where the battleground was, and to an extent still is, right? Like, our attention is what gets monetized. And going back to what I was saying before about, the sort of concept of flow state and like why I've been building a company around it, is like being in flow state or trying to build your ability to concentrate on things in a really deep way pulls that control back to you as an individual and away from all these absolute like scummy people who are trying to literally capture your attention. And like, there is a real innocent use of that phrase, capturing your attention. It's nice. You've noticed something fun, you walk past an attractive flower, you see it at the moment, see a whale on the horizon, that's cool, that's capturing my attention in a nice way. But what these people are trying to do is capture your attention because they can make money from your attention, which is a much more grubby and personally damaging to you way of capturing attention. So there's a real like sort of subversive negative idea about that to me. And this is where I think, why we're seeing a lot of the resurgence in interest of like positive psychology stuff, like the flow state, right? And like meditation and all these like sort of new apps emerging, like Headspace has been around for ages. Like your ability to control how you behave and react to things and how you think has never been more important than it is right now. And like, I know that's a cliche that gets bandied around a lot, but the challenge that we all have at the moment is that a lot of people, because they don't, they're not as deeply immersed in the digital industry as maybe some of us are, is that they don't realize even what they're giving away. And like, you will have heard the phrase, like, if something's free, you're the product, basically, right? But we've been so, just chucked onto Facebook, chucked onto Instagram, you're on what was Twitter, now X, Blue Sky, whatever networks you use. They've just become a daily habit, and you're giving yourself away to these companies, right? And they make money from you, like your time that you give them. This is like really serious stuff that takes away from your ability to actually relate to other people properly, to concentrate on things, to have control of how you're thinking. And this is what draws me back to, the degree, the idea of like philosophy and like mental control is not some sort of nebulous concept. It's in the small decisions that we all make every day about how we spend our time. So look, like, this is where, this is the sort of foundational thinking all around flow state itself and the company. And what I want to kind of like lead on to, and why I want to draw this link is like, I'm not just trying to shamelessly leap off the back of what I would suggest is much more, valuable work in some respects than what we do at Flow State, but like the core concepts around the company, like, are very deeply tied to, going back now quite a long time to when I was at uni, going way back to the end of when I was doing my A levels before I even went to uni. Like this idea of like being in control very actively of how you think. And I want to throw around this quite a Victorian concept, right, of the differentiation between the material or the physical animal body and the soul, as they used to characterize it, or the intellectual. side of personalities. And what they used to think around the sort of 18th and 19th century and into the start of the 20th was that those two sides of people were kind of at war, right? You had your animal passions, as they used to call them, that were trying to very reactive, you react to the world around you, and that's all driven by the physical stuff. And they thought at the time that you could tame those passions using the intellect or the soul at the time, and say, look, no, the war between the intellectual and the animal, if you like, was it all the rage back in the day. And we have a different version of that now, because we have the the kind of war between people who are attempting to usurp your control over your mental state and you as an individual and your ability to, retain control over how you react. So that war, as they would have characterized it a few hundred years ago, between the the material and the sort of metaphysical plane, has now moved into the metaphysical plane, and like we almost don't really care about the physical side anymore, almost, which is a bit depressing. But I think, again, that's quite an interesting way of thinking about this, because what's becoming more and more dangerous now, in the age of AI, as we're probably in, right, is where that, I don't like to characterize things in terms of a war for anything, because it's just, I'm not a war guy. I'm quite a pacifist, really. But I think it is one. I think it's it's moved into a space that is harder to control, because some of us find it hard to control that, like physical reactions as well, right? Like, but I think that challenge, if you don't know how or why you're doing things, then you will just do things, and then you will struggle to undo the consequences of the actions that you took because you didn't know why you were taking them, which is not the most eloquent way I've ever described something, but that's going back to what we're saying. That's what people are doing now, right? That's what they're all struggling with. They're struggling to undo behaviors that have been taught to them by people whose only motivation is to make as much money as possible. And again, I'm going to use Facebook as an example of this, because, I was there at the launch of Facebook, and I've seen the history of Facebook and how it's evolved. And they were one of the first. They were one of the pioneers of this kind of behavioral engineering to make money from your mental energy and attention, and that is pretty disgusting to the degree that they've done it. So how does all this relate to what I'm doing right now and what you should be thinking about, both at work and in life, right? So why? Asking why. Now, love him or hate him, Simon Sinek, if you haven't heard of him, was the man who sort of popularized, I guess, the why for business. But obviously the philosophers of all the many years, going back 4,000 years or so, have been asking why for much longer. It's just Simon Sinek's a more recent example of this. And the way that he characterizes this is obviously pretty businessy. It's like how to really get down to your purpose, right? But the power of asking why is that it is a directly sort of challenging question that children ask everywhere, and a lot of adults seem to forget to ask. Just about what you're doing. You challenge yourself. Be like, why am I doing things? Why do I think this? Why do I behave this way? And you might not like the answers that you get, and you don't have to tell anyone, right? But if you've ever been to, any kind of therapy, or done any kind of like meditation, or been in any sort of, self-help type of an environment, the question of why always comes up at some point, because that is the only way that you can start to really uncover your base motivations, or as far as you can get to them. And I think it was Simon Sinek who originally came up with like the 7 levels of why. But you've got to keep asking, like little kids do, right? Because the reason that they ask stuff is they want to get down to the core of something. And again, going back to my philosophical training, this is one of the core principles of how we discover things and how we attain new knowledge. Is you have to question everything and be like, why do we do stuff? Why am I doing what I'm doing right now? So look, it's an interesting exercise. If you haven't read this book, it's really interesting. I would highly recommend reading it, even if you just that was a load of crap. It's just great to think about things in different ways. And so much of work is a routine that we all just stick to because of reasons, because that's the way work's structured, without considering the whys of why we're doing it. And that's just pretty depressing, right? I mean, like, if you just want to go to work and just do work, that's totally fine, because you understand why you're doing it, right? You're like, I just need money. I'm going to go and do this stuff and just get money, and I'm going to ignore it. Like, you've got a bit of a why there, right? But a lot of people come to work and they have this sort of vague idea of why they're doing it, but it's very, undefined, and it can be quite challenging. Or as my Australian friends would say, confronting. But I think that's a good thing, right? It's fine to be uncomfortable occasionally and be challenged, even if you're just challenging yourself. So look, I don't want to big up Simon beyond that, but asking why, very important. And I guess the reason that this, sort of relates to what I'm doing with Flow State, and the reason that I wanted to make this a bit more of a, sort of a little sort of biographical rundown of where we're at with the company, is all these discussions I've been having with everyone who's come on the show, even going back to 2023, about like, the explosion of AI itself, the evolution of the digital industry, like where we're at with our relationship with technology, and obviously centering those things around the disciplines of marketing and sales. That marketing and sales are very human-centric jobs and disciplines, right? Like, there is no way that you can replace the human stuff there. You can replace a lot of the machinery and the foundational boring crap behind the scenes with process automation and whatever, but ultimately the decision to engage with a brand or with a product or buy something or not is an emotionally driven decision, and there is no way, while people are still involved in that process, it's always going to be made ultimately by emotion. Whether you trust somebody or you love a thing, or like, it's triggered something in you, that is why you do stuff. And you can deny it as much as you like, but if you are really honest with yourself, no amount of logic and sort of, dry reasoning is going to justify a purchase decision without some form of emotional engagement with that thing. So I'm happy to die on that hill. I'm going to go out there with that one. And look, the reason that that's related to what I'm talking about now and flow, and look, I would also recommend reading Mihal's book on the psychology of happiness. So he's been talking about this for like 40 years, I think now. But this is another great book, just really interesting, super sort of inspiring read. And I found this really interesting because a lot of the time, like, the way that I arrive at things is sort of by a process of elimination. And going back to what I was saying earlier, I'm not necessarily the most positively minded person, I would say. And it's not to say that I'm all, sad all the time and just, sort of doom and gloom. But I often have to sort of start to arrive at what I want to do by thinking about things that I don't want to do. And the reason that's related to sort of the lameness of work and the routine is that, like many people, I think that the 9 to 5 sort of structure of work is quite stupid and outdated. Let me qualify that for the kind of work that I do, right? So, like many of you, I work on a computer. The internet is essentially my work. I can do work on or off the internet. I can do that work from anywhere at any time that I like, right? I have to be online when I want to talk to my clients and when they want to talk to me. But the people I've been working with are all of a very similar mindset, right? We all want to be in control of when we're working. And the whole point of working on the internet or working with the internet, or if you're in marketing or sales, is most people want to meet when they're in, at their best, right? And they've got something to say and it's worthwhile spending some time together. However, the entire, Victorian era industrial revolutionary structure of work is not engineered around that. That is engineered around a time when we were producing physical things, and the amount of value that could be derived from the economy was very directly tied to the amount of things that you could produce and how much you could sell those things for. Now, we no longer work in that world, do we? Like, there is a part of it, sure, people are still producing stuff, that's fine. But even the production of stuff can happen at any time now. So the idea that we're still working on this like ridiculous Monday to Friday, 9 to 5 routine is just completely like not only redundant, but just ridiculous. And it's one of those stupid concepts that's just been enforced on everyone because that's the way we've always done it. And people are too scared to make big changes, right? And like, without going off on too much of a tangent, one of my advisors in the UK was a part of the 4-day week trial that ran there. I think it was either a year or two ago. And there's been some limited trials of that here. And the majority of the companies that were in that trial, right? So the trial was that you would still have all the same benefits of working 5 days a week, but you would just work 4. most of the companies carried it on after the trial was done, and there was no material difference in the output from the companies that were in that trial when people worked 4 days instead of 5. However, there was a reported material improvement in everyone's state of mind and general feelings of, positivity around how they were working, because they're not forced to squeeze their lives into 2 days when nothing's fucking open and nothing's happening. So, without drifting off too much into a huge rant about the general structure of society, like, we've all experienced that, right? I've done my fair share of crap jobs before I started doing what I do now. When I was in the 9 to 5, you can't go to the bank, you've got to go on your lunchtime, you can't go to the doctors, you've got to take half a day off. You can't live your life. Well, you can, but it's just crap because it's all dictated by someone else, which, going back to what I was saying before, is frustrating. That sets us in the wrong state of mind about how we're all trying to live our lives in general. So, again, one of the core reasons that I, with particular reference to flow state, when I started doing this, and the reason that I started kind of contracting and running my own businesses is like, yes, there's some boring sides of it, and yes, not all of it's, just running around doing whatever you like all the time, but I like to be in control of what I'm doing when, and the people that I've managed to work with over the course of the last 10 or 15 years, when I've either been contracting or working in startups or running my own businesses, when, we're building a product business now and flow state itself is part sort of service, part product, is that I want to be able to work when I know that I'm doing my best work, and I want to empower the people that I work with to know that they can do the same thing with me. So within the context of our relationships, we can both be at our best whenever we're talking to each other. We deliver whatever value we're engaged to deliver. That's the basic table stakes, right, of what we're doing. But the important part to me of the relationships that I'm trying to build and the people that I want to work with is that we're solving, for big problems. That's why I shifted to moving to B2B. I had fun doing B2C stuff, and it was great working with some really awesome brands in that space. But it's kind of more fun to be working with some much bigger, thornier businesses that are supporting bigger stuff, basically infrastructure stuff, healthcare stuff, massively impactful technology-based sort of solutions is exciting, right? But the challenge with those is that often you're working with people across different time zones, in different countries, different cultures. And I find that really interesting, but I think the way to make that work is, like I was saying, you want to, don't have meetings that could have been emails, that's why Slack and stuff's great. Asynchronous working's awesome. If everyone can get into a good routine of being online and doing their deep work when they want to be doing it, and you only connect when it's really valuable and purposeful to connect and be like, look, when do we really need to engage each other for the human work? That's when you can collectively sort of try to approach getting into something like, a sort of team version of flow state. And that, that's stretching the concept because it doesn't really work in that way in that sense. But that's what, to me, makes me feel like I'm doing something that's more valuable and meaningful. And I know that that's what makes everyone else feel like they're doing something valuable and meaningful, right? Because then you can concentrate on the core of your job, hopefully the stuff you enjoy, and you can just push away all the extraneous bullshit parts, right? Nobody likes sitting in boring meetings all day. Nobody likes being told, like a child, that you have to be at a desk at 9 a.m. exactly, because otherwise, you're going to be in trouble for being a minute late or 5 minutes late or whatever. It's just not very empowering or very rewarding to be treated like that. And there's no reason why we should be. So, part of flow state is, in a small way, I guess, I'm trying to bring that to the people I work with, right? I don't care when I get emails. I don't care when people are messaging me. I just try and make it clear when I'm online and when I'm going to be doing stuff. And if we need to connect, we can connect whenever. It's simple, powerful stuff to me. And I hope the people I work with. And the solutions that we're building, that's why flow state itself can be challenging to sell, because it's not an agency, although I have to describe it as one to sort of sometimes get the concept across. It is a hybrid business that combines consulting and service delivery with technology in a way that just delivers the goods, I think. It's not one thing or the other. It's a blend of all of them. But the whole core concept behind the business and everything that we pull together is to remove as much of the crap as we can and just do the really valuable parts and just minimize the admin and the nonsense, because that's what makes us all do our best work. I guess. So that, I guess, is how I'm kind of getting around slowly to where we're at as a business. And like what we've been working on a lot recently, which is challenging, is nailing that sort of positioning effectively and just being able to pull that together. And that's where, coming around to some of the creative side, the reason that there's jellyfish everywhere is like, it's like one of the most zen creatures ever, right? They just float around having an awesome time, unless then there's some turtles or some whales or the many things that might eat them, and maybe they're not having an awesome time. I don't know. They're pretty alien in terms of the way they live, but the fun thing about them is that there's some jellyfish that are in fact immortal. Like they can actually go back and regress to a baby-like state and then regrow to adult life again. They just float around taking things as they come. That was kind of where that came from. And as we're saying here, look, like what we're hanging our hat around at the moment in the business is moving brands from awareness to opportunity by pulling together all those things that I was just talking about, flow, positive psychology, and getting into that kind of flow of working with everybody, thinking really hard about why we are doing things before we do them. Like we don't just rush to execute stuff, which is where, the consulting pieces come in. We help everyone really work out what is most valuable to the people that we're working with. How can we enable our contacts and the people we work with directly to just be awesome at their jobs? Like that's why you engage people like me as an external partner to come in and help you be awesome at what you're doing. My old friend Mihai, like why the secret to actually being a bit happier at work? How do we just make everything a bit more fun and a bit more meaningful? That's what everybody wants. And then winding all the way back to the very start, how do we help everybody learn more fun stuff? Like the reason that I'm still in the digital industry, despite sounding quite a lot like I complain about it sometimes, it is one of the fastest moving industries still at the moment. There is so much to learn in digital. And if you push aside the agendas of other people, coming way back to where we started with the why of why I'm doing everything and the philosophical mindset, right? The digital industry, the establishment digital industry would like to tell you that there are certain ways that everything should be done now, because the industry's been around long enough, right, to have certain rules being established and certain agendas are kind of getting set down, right? But I would say that those are the ones that should be immediately challenged by the agendas of companies that are trying to tell you how to spend your money, companies that are trying to tell you how to spend your time and attention. Those are the people that you should be immediately suspicious of. And that is one of the core ways that we have pulled together all of our solutions. And just to conclude this, the reason that I still focus so heavily on the organic side of digital is exactly that. The advertising side, the spend your money side, is a mix of easy, effective stuff, semi-harder, expensive stuff, and then people trying to tell you how to spend money because it makes them money. The organic side of how do you take your message to people in a manner and a medium that allows you to control everything about how that message goes out is much more interesting and much more powerful and contains much more long-range value to you and your business than any of the other money-based instant activity stuff you can do. So that is the end of that. So I hope you found that interesting. I just wanted to take some time this week just to explain a bit more about the actual business and the thinking around the business, because I think all this stuff is really important, and for me it's really important because that is why I'm doing what I'm doing. And if I have spoken to you recently and we've just met, I hope that you found this informative, and if you have known me for a long time, then hopefully this has been a nice refresher in amongst our usual connecting, doing the business, and possibly just generally whinging about the state of work and life. So look, I still don't have a great ending to the show, I'm afraid. So once again, that is the end of the podcast. Thanks for joining me, and hopefully you will rejoin again. If you'd like to talk to me about any of this stuff, as you can tell, I love to talk about all of it. If you were like, Stu, I don't agree with any of that, great, come on and disagree. I would love to talk to you about what you think, and we can have a proper discussion about it. And hopefully there was something useful in there for you. Definitely get one of those books, get both, have a read. Enjoy the long weekend if you are in one of the East Coast states. WA, I think you maybe already had yours, and I'll chat to you all soon.